Ah. So we decided to discuss this topic in part because so many children's books are being published right now, and so many of them do not stick around for very long. And also because there's so many wonderful books out there that have lasted, and we thought it would be interesting to just discuss what makes a kid's book last, what elements in different kinds of children's books or books about children's books um, are have a lasting effect on our readership. Um, I guess just to give you a quick introduction, Sneed, I'm assuming that you, yeah. Sneed is mainly writes books about nature, not altogether, and some other things. He's graduated with honors in marine biology from UC Berkeley and earned a master's degree from UC Santa Barbara. He has written more than 85 award-winning nonfiction and fiction books for young people, including Woodpeckers Drilling Holes and Bagging Bugs, One Iguana, Two Iguanas, A Story of Accident, Natural Selection and Evolution, and Birds of Every Color, which my grandson just loves. And in some of these books, he's using his own photography, which is really pretty spectacular in my opinion. So Leonard Marcus is a historian, writer, editor, and curator, and one of the world's leading authorities on children's books and the people who create them. He's the author of more than 25 award-winning books, including Margaret Wise Brown, Awakened by the Moon, Dear Genius, The Letters of Ursula Nordstrom, which I love, have always loved, Minders of Make-Believe, The Annotated Phantom Toll Booth, Golden Legacy, The Story of Golden Books, and many, many more. And he's recently, just really recently, published You Can't Say That, a book about censorship and the literature of young people. And he's done so many other things, but I'm going to limit what I say. I'm a novelist and an illustrator, as well as a fine artist, and I exhibit in museums and galleries around the country. And some of my books have ended up in being exhibited at the Peabody Essex Museum. That was as part of branching out. Trees as Art was a book called Clothed in Bark, which is actually an adult book. And my illustration and children's books were featured at Strathmore Foundation in the exhibit Turning the Page. And I also have many award-winning books, but I'm also own a very small micropress, 26-year-old micropress called Lionstone Books. So we're going to start off by talking about, we each chose a book that was a favorite of ours that we hope that most people would know, and talk about what part of it we thought was what made it last. And so that's our first round, and I picked Winnie the Pooh, originally The House at Pooh Corner. And this is an older copy of it. This is from I want to say 1940, but I'm not sure. I think it's 1940. And I picked Winnie the Pooh because everybody knows it. But what I love about Winnie the Pooh is it captures all of the wonder of childhood, and all the funny things that kids do and say are sort of incorporated into the stories. I know my son read it when I read it to him, he read it again and again. And when he was 16, I heard him laughing in his room, and I went in and he was rereading Winnie the Pooh. And it occurred to me that one of the things that I think makes some children's books last is a sort of double level at which they work. So I think Winnie the Pooh works at both an adult level and a child level. I also think that the original illustrations are really wonderful and sort of suited. They're very whimsical, by E.H. Shepard. And I also love the language of Winnie the Pooh. I love the sentence structure. I love the rhythm of the language. as well as what's being said. So for me, those are things that are really important for any book to last, or the language, sentence structure, that for children, that double level of meaning for both an adult and a child, to get different, and then that brings children back to reread them again and again. So I guess that's it. And we are to, I think that Leonard is going next, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you want me to get started?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm gonna talk about Goodnight Moon, which is another book that I think everyone probably is somewhat familiar with. These days, just about any newborn child might receive multiple copies from family, friends. It's come to be thought of as the perfect first book for a child to know in their life. Um, you might be surprised to know that when the book was new in 1947, it was regarded as a very strange book. It didn't tell a traditional story, essentially had one picture repeated over and over again from different angles, and it didn't have a hero who did anything. So the library world was not at all receptive to the book. New York Public didn't buy the book for its collection until 1974. So remember, it was published in 1947. It gives you an idea. But and I didn't, probably for those reasons, I didn't know about it when I was a child. It wasn't everywhere, but I discovered it in a bookstore when I was about 28 years old, and had already begun to be interested in the history of children's books, and was also writing a lot of poetry. And so I picked it up from a table in a bookstore in Greenwich Village and read it to myself, and thought, gee, this is like what Emily Dickinson had said. A chill had gone up my spine, which was the sign that this was real poetry. And I thought how remarkable that someone could write a poem that touched me and could also touch a 1 or 2 year old. Well, certainly the language has everything to do with that. What has been said about literature, that it's the right words in the right order. It doesn't tell a story, but what it does do is that it creates a kind of very simple ritual for children and their caregivers to carry out on their own, and also to improvise on at bedtime, saying goodnight to things in your own room as well as the things that are in the bunny's room. Um, so it's a very flexible form, and I think it addresses the very first challenge that every human being faces in life, which is coming to feel at home in the world when the world is completely new to you. And that's what happens to this little bunny, because he finds out that the world has a certain structure and order and harmony to it, and he has a place within that world. The art does a lot to add to that as well. But I think maybe I've given you enough of a taste of why this book has lasted. So let's hear from Sneed now.
Oh, okay. Well, before I start, I just want to thank everyone at 1455 for inviting us here today, and for Sallie for putting together this panel here. And I'm so glad you both focused on fiction books, because I'd like to focus on what makes a nonfiction book a timeless classic. And the first thing I have to say is that it's very, very rare and exceedingly difficult for a children's nonfiction book to become a classic. And there's several reasons for that. One is that often nonfiction subjects are updated every few years. New books are coming out about them, and they replace the old books, and the old books kind of disappear. And another thing about them is that adult readers just don't embrace nonfiction books the way they embrace fiction books. They go to a nonfiction book to learn something, but think about the last children's nonfiction book you read. Do you remember the author's name? Probably not, right? And so that's just something we nonfiction writers live with, and it's perfectly fine. But when there does emerge a nonfiction book that is a timeless classic, a number of things go into that. One is story and character, compelling stories, compelling characters, plots. And that's probably why most nonfiction classics tend to be biographies, right? Because there's a built-in story, there's a built-in character. But for other nonfiction books, especially life science type books or that I write, there are several other things that go into making them classic. And to demonstrate that, I'd like to tell you all this, something I call the story of two Larrys, which is two of my favorite authors of nonfiction who both happen to be named Larry. The first one is Larry Pringle, who's written more than 200 nonfiction books, some of which you may begin to think of as classics, such as The Secret Life of the Red Fox and Dinosaurs Strange and Wonderful. But the book that I consider, I think of first when I think of him, is a book that really impressed me when I read it many years ago. And it's called Batman, Exploring the World of Bats. Now, this book, I believe, is out of print, but I still consider it a classic. And for one thing, it's got that plot and that character. In fact, there's two main characters in here. Merlin Tuttle, who kind of pioneered modern bat research in a lot of ways and started Bat Conservation International. But the other character, of course, are the bats, right? And both of these are riveting characters. So what makes this a classic besides that? Well, several different things. It's groundbreaking, right? It's new information, or at least information presented in a new way that we've never seen before. And that makes a nonfiction book really stand out. But it's also a couple other things. One is just the voice of the author, which is not only authoritative, but soothing. Leonard and Sallie both talked about language. Well, in language of a classic nonfiction book, it may not be so obviously beautiful, but it makes you at home and comfortable and kind of creates this subtle tension that keeps you want to keep reading. The third thing, though, is the original research that goes into a nonfiction book. And I think this is a key to making a nonfiction book a classic. Which brings me to my next Larry story, which is an author named Larry Dane Grimner, who's also written more than 100 books. And many of these I consider to be modern classics. He's done this wonderful civil rights series of books, a couple of which have won Cybert Awards, including the books in that series include 12 Days in May, Freedom Ride 1961, the subject which is self-explanatory. One of my favorites is called Accused, it's brand new, The Trials of the Scottsboro Boys, Lies, Prejudice, and the 14th Amendment. And the reason it's one of my favorites is not only a great topic, but because it was dedicated to me. So I had to plug that, right? But the one I probably my favorite of the whole series was the first one that he wrote, was called We Are One, The Story of Baird Rustin. And all of the things I mentioned before help make this a classic. It's got a compelling plot, which is the March in Washington in 1963. It's got compelling characters, including this man, Baird Rustin, who turns out was instrumental in organizing this march. But he's been kind of ignored by history. Well, why is that? Well, a big reason, he was gay. And because of that, he got shoved under the carpet. And so this book really stands out. It breaks new ground and it teaches us a lot of something we didn't know was going on. Again, the voice just makes you want to read. It's very dramatic voice. And yet it keeps this tension going that you want. And again, he went to original research. And so those things are all things that I think really help make a nonfiction book a classic. And now I'll turn it back to Sallie to maybe so we can hear a little bit about one of her own books that she thinks of as a classic and why that is.
I don't know if I'd use the word classic exactly, but just that it's a book that has staying power, lasting power. It's really hard to choose. it's really hard to make a choice about which book you think you should show or not show and something like this. So first, I should say that when I write a book, because I'm an artist and I've been an artist for longer than I've been a writer, actually, I always told many stories and loved making up stories, but I didn't take my writing seriously until I was in my 30s, whereas I started selling my artwork when I was 15. I knew I'd be an artist when I was 10. So I think as a result of that, whenever I write a book, and I write both young adult picture books and even some middle grade, it's always illustrated. Even my young adult novels are illustrated. I see the art when I write, and it's really important to me that that art fit into the structure and the art tells part of my story. So my books aren't finished until they have their art in them and they're designed. So structure is really important to me. I'm not interested in straight line plots, really. But the book I picked, Sender Unknown, it unfortunately is a vertical, so I don't know if it's getting on the screen altogether. This book, first of all, I think, especially for kids today, I work with a lot of teenagers. I do young adult writing workshops, and I've run them for probably, too many years, but at least 26, 27 years consecutively. And the kids tell me that they really are tired of romance, teen romance. One kid said to me, don't they know we are interested in other things? They're really tired of vampires. They say they hope they never see another vampire book. But they want a read that's different. They really are looking for things that are different, both structurally and in their language and in terms of what the story is about. And Sender Unknown certainly meets that standard. It's a little bit of everything. It's not really any one particular genre. It's a little bit of science fiction. It even has a sort of prince and princess story in it. It's, I guess maybe it's got some superhero references. And I think the kids really like it because it's fun, but it has some serious topics in it that are discussed, and because it has an ending that they don't guess and they don't see coming, and they really like that. So rather than tell you why I think it's classic, I thought I would read a letter I happened to just get from a fan who read it first when she was 11 and she's now 26. And she said, I have to find where, what has made Sender Unknown a book I reread and recommend to my friends, even as an adult, is more than its prophetic prediction of a world where technology has replaced creativity, though that's definitely part of it for me. It is a timeless story of found family and chosen family. Markham, who's the central character, is someone extraordinary whose attempt at becoming ordinary and socially acceptable only shows him what is so special about being different and enables him to pass that confidence on to a new generation of children, all unrelated, all eccentrically gifted, who become the accepting family he's always craved. The completely unexpected revelation at the end brings a beautiful full circle to the story and a hopeful bent that plays into the timelessness of the tale, encouraging all of us to believe that what we create has value and that with our unique perspectives, we can change the world. As much as I've spent years longing for a sequel, I think part of the timeless nature of Sender Unknown is that it doesn't need one, because it ends with hope and leaves its readers to do the rest of the work, build change for our world and a better future. I don't think there's anything more timeless than hope wrapped in universal truth. So I was very flattered, let me tell you, to get a letter like that. So I think that I'll leave it on her words. And we go, I guess we're to you again, Mark, Leonard.
Yeah. Okay. Hi. So the book I'm going to talk about is this one. It's
Ah,
called Dear Genius, The Letters of Ursula Nordstrom. Um, it's a collection of actual letters written by an editor, publisher of children's books named Ursula Nordstrom, who was at Harper from 1940 to 1973. I would describe her as the great visionary publisher of American children's books of the last half century. She published Goodnight Moon. She published Where the Wild Things Are, Harriet the Spy, Harold and the Purple Crayon, and many, many other books that I bet everyone here has come across one time or another. She never went to college. She liked to say that the college she never went to was Bryn Mawr, which tells you that she had a wonderful sense of humor. She was an omnivorous reader, and she identified with the child as an underdog, as someone who's the less powerful person in their world more often than not, with intense emotions and keen awareness of everything going on all around. And she thought that children's books ought to be a lot more real with their readers than they had been in the past, when childhood tended to be sentimentalized, and children tended, as we were just saying a moment ago about romance books. It's not all about going to the prom to be a young person growing up. Certainly not these days. So Ursula published all these really cutting edge books, and these letters that I put together, there were over 100,000 to choose from, and I chose about 400. So you can imagine how much reading went into all this, and thinking and editing. These letters show you many of these classic books in the making. For example, here's a letter that she wrote to Crockett Johnson, author of Harold and the Purple Crayon, after seeing the first rough version of the book. Oh, wait a minute. Did I? I may have lost my place. Sorry. Needless to say, she wasn't sure it was a good book. It's such a strange book, as you probably know. This little boy making up his world as he goes along. And in the rough version, she just wasn't quite clear about his idea. And she was very good at helping artists clarify what they aimed to do. So it may very well be that the dummy she saw wasn't really that good. But then she added that she was having a complicated day, and she would probably turn down The Adventures of Tom Sawyer had that come to her desk. Uh, so she was part of her self-deprecation. I mean, that was part of her way of engaging writers and artists and getting them to feel like they were the center of attention, and that what they thought and did was what mattered the most to her. She was willing slyly to take a backseat to them a good part of the time. I do have a letter here that I wanted to read you. It's often said that second novels or second books are the hardest ones for people to write. You publish your first book and maybe you put your whole heart and soul into it, and then what? And this is a letter written by Ursula to a young person who published one picture book called Baby. Her name is Fran Minushkin, and she also happened to be on the staff at Harper. And Fran Minushkin had hit a roadblock when it came to maybe moving ahead in her career. So this is what Ursula said. I'm sorry that work on your next Harper book is not going easily, but that happens, you know. Second books are never easy, and Baby is such a knockout that you will tend to keep thinking you've got to top it. You can't top it, of course. There is no other book like it, and you will not write another book like it. But you will write one just as good in its own way. You simply must not let the thought of Baby come into your mind when you are working, or when you are trying to keep the channel open, which was a line from a book that she liked to quote about being true to yourself. You are one of the most gifted persons I have ever known, and I have known a lot of them. You have marvelous emotional equipment, and that is what the finest creative artists have. You're going to have to write out of your own emotions, and you're going to have to trust your emotions. You're a terrific person, vitality and creative energy, and there isn't the slightest chance in the world that you are not going to write many, many, many wonderful books. So one of the things that an editor can do for you is to give you that kind of encouragement and kind of open the door to the future, which can be so scary for any creative person. So this book of mine, which has been in print now for about 25 years and has now been published around the world in China, Japan, and elsewhere, was published primarily for adults, but lots of teens read this book because it gives you a glimpse of what a career in the book world can be like, for one thing. And it's also a book about becoming yourself, which is kind of the business of being a teenager, stepping away from the family circle, which has been protecting you if, things have gone well up until that time, and having to decide who you, apart from all that, are, to yourself and for the rest of the world. And Ursula, being this self-taught person and being someone who championed so many other self-made artists and writers, is a wonderful role model and I would say inspiration. The last thing I'll say is that one of the people she discovered, the very young Marie Sendak, um, drew the portrait of her on the cover of this book.
Oh,
And if you should come in close contact with the copy, take a really good look at that portrait, because as a tribute to her, he hid a wild thing somewhere in that picture.
Mm.
And only one person has ever found it so far.
So just before Sneed goes on, I just want to say I love that book. I read that book probably 10 years ago, and I recommend it to all the young writers that I work with who go on to be writers. A lot of them really do. And it's a real look at another era of how authors were regarded as well, I think, which is because things are very different now. And I think it's really a wonderful book. I love that book.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
And now we're to Sneed.
oh, terrific. Well, boy, that was fun. I have so many questions for both of you, but I'll do my thing here first. I've been, when thinking about my own work, I've been lucky actually to have several classic nonfiction books. As hard as it is to have a nonfiction classic book, I've been fortunate that way. One of my first one definitely was Animal Dads, which came out, 25 years ago and is still going strong. Um, Another one that I wrote, a little lesser known, well known, is Shep, Our Most Loyal Dog, a true story about a dog growing up in Montana. That's kind of a regional legend.
Oh.
A book called A Platypus Probably, which has had remarkable staying power for the last 20 years or so. And astonishingly, a book I wrote called Beaks, which is actually more popular now than it was when it came out 20 years ago. And all of these books have several things in common. They have high interest subjects that they may have been done before, but never quite in this way. They also almost all have really amazing art. Beaks, you can see by Robin Brickman here. Uses cut paper collage, as does Animal Dads, which was illustrated by Steve Jenkins. And they all have a voice that I think is really comforting and compelling for young people. But because it's easier to do a picture book, I wanted to focus on an older nonfiction classic. And as I mentioned, it's much harder to come up with one of those. And again, because topics are replaced all the time, people don't focus really on the author as much. But one of my more recent books that I think is on its way to becoming a classic is called Hopping Ahead of Climate Change, Snowshoe Hares, Science and Survival. And there's several reasons I think this book, it won several awards and it continues to sell steadily. And one of the reasons I think is, first, it has compelling characters. It has a scientist who studied snowshoe hares, and it's got the snowshoe hares themselves, both of which interest a lot of readers. It's about a very important topic, but it's presented in a way that had not been presented before. and that is looking at one single animal and how it's coping with this huge problem that the world faces right now. And because it focuses on that one animal, though, it tends not to be as overwhelming for readers. You know, you can just think about this animal, not worry about the entire world ending at the same time. And then the way it's written, it's just solid storytelling. Voice is a huge part of this book. It's got a lot of drama in it, but it also, for instance, I'll read the prelude here so you can get an idea of some of the drama in it. The introduction is called Light Bulbs with Legs. It's late October, almost Halloween. Dawn breaks across the northern Rocky Mountains and a snowshoe hare hops through the forest in search of food. It pauses frequently to nibble on grasses, leaves, and the twigs of low-growing fir and large trees. Although the sky is light, the hare does not seem overly concerned about getting eaten. This time of year, its dazzling white coat blends in perfectly with snow. The camouflage provides excellent protection against lynx, coyotes, marten, and other predators. Unfortunately, this year, the hare has a problem. There is no snow. And this photograph perfectly encapsulates the problem right there. Look at that. If you're a camouflage creature and you're not really camouflaged, you've got an issue, right? And so this book has really intrigued a lot of readers. One other thing it has in it that I think is very important for nonfiction books, but also very rare, is humor. In fact, some of my most popular nonfiction books have a lot of humor in them. Sometimes I come up with this myself, but often I find it in the characters that I am researching. Oh, and again, this is original research, which is something else that makes a nonfiction book stand out. So chapter one, we've got a chapter called The Cheeseburger of the Forest, and it talks about how important hares are to other species. It starts out, Scott Mills parks his truck near one of his favorite study areas, just outside of Seeley Lake, Montana. This place is a hotbed for hares, he points out. Not only is there a good number of hares here, but for hare country, it's pretty forgiving. It's flat, which makes it a lot easier to hike around in winter and summer. It also makes tracking the hares easier. And then he goes on to talk about how important hares are later. Hares don't die of old age, Scott explains. Anything that eats meat in the forest feeds on snowshoe hares. Coyote, foxes, bobcats, lynx, owls, goshawks, weasels, marten, fishers, everything. Even some things you don't expect, like red squirrels, feed on newborn hares. I call hares the candy bar of the forest, but my students call them the cheeseburger of the forest. A few hares live for 4 years. A few more live 3 and some 2 years. Most live only a year or less. So in the reviews of this book, what do you think they focused on? The cheeseburger of the forest, right? So that really stood out. And I think humor like that, even though this is a case of a little bit gruesome humor, makes a huge difference in making a book timeless or a classic. So yeah, so with that, oh, before we start tackling questions, I want to just briefly share this contact information page. The book that Sallie featured and some of these other books we mentioned can be difficult to find, but you can order her book directly through lionstonebooks.com or email her at sallielowenstein@gmail.com. And Leonard's and my information is also down here if you want to take a quick look at it. And I'll show that again at the end of our talk so you guys can look at that. But anyway, Sallie, did you want to start going through our list of questions we can answer?
Well, I thought maybe you sort of covered one of them, and I don't know if Leonard wanted to add anything, but what kinds of research or information changes, how a nonfiction book becomes a classic. I don't know if you wanted to add anything. I'm primarily not a nonfiction writer. I do some of it, but mainly I don't. So I don't know. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Leonard?
Um, uh, Maybe not. I mean, it's an interesting question for sure, and I think often in science books and history books, new information does emerge. I think of somebody like David Macaulay's books, like Cathedral, for example. That was published in 1973, and I think it remains as valid as it ever was. And but it's partly the power of his drawing, his draftsmanship, and the research behind his drawing and his understanding of the architecture and engineering of cathedrals. And it's kind of a hybrid book because he invented characters who were representative of historical characters. So he struck a very interesting balance. I'll just say one more thing about this. One of the things Ursula Nordstrom talked about very often to her illustrators was to beware of putting too many topical references in illustrations that might date after 5 or 10 years. And when Maurice Sendak was drawing the child's bedroom, Max's bedroom, for Where the Wild Things Are, he was very careful to avoid almost anything, any artifact that could be, datable as from the 1960s when the book was being created. And I think that really did make a lot of sense in terms of keeping that book, fiction on the face of it, but also something from the real world, one that continues to seem as applicable now as it used to.
So, although I
Add to the Leonard's book that he talked about is a great example of original research going to letters from people. And that's something that also can really make a book stand out. Just one example of the original research. Because I write about more contemporary issues, a lot of times I'm interviewing people who are doing the work, that there's so many great historical resources that Larry Dane Brimner does and Leonard goes to, whether it's Library of Congress letters or photographs or old interviews that never really saw the light of day, that sort of thing. And so I just think that original research is such an important thing to make a book really stand out, because many authors just don't have time, or frankly, they're too lazy to go find it, And so that can really help create a timeless book.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, when you immerse yourself in research, I find at the beginning, it feels very chaotic, and that could be a reason why some people are put off by it, because there's so much that you don't know and so much that you don't know how to interpret, and but then as you get deeper into it, it starts to come together in a kind of almost like a wonderful mosaic, and you begin to find the pattern. And something we haven't mentioned is that, although nonfiction is rooted in fact, the world of fact, it's still storytelling, and it's still, the writer still has to make a story out of the stuff that emerges from all that research. So in some ways, it's not that different from fiction. You're just sworn to the facts. You can't make them up.
Well, the other way around, because in fiction, sometimes I know that for Sender Unknown, I did this because the illustrations are all pages of toy catalogs. And so I did a lot of research on toys, and I didn't want to date it either. But on the other hand, there's something about going back into the past to say, these toys were exciting to people of another era. And so there's a lot of information you can give. I frequently do research for my nonfiction, for my fiction. Another book that I did a lot of research for was Waiting for Eugene, which is a post-Holocaust book. And I did a huge amount of research for that book. And one of the things that I ended up doing research on, because the characters in that book are the father is an architect, was I had never drawn any kind of architecture, really. I mean, I've drawn buildings, but I had never tried to do architectural drawings. And so my daughter is an architect, and the first thing she said to me was, "Mom, those are beautiful drawings, but you couldn't walk in the house."
Ah,
So I ended up having to really take a really hard, long look at drawing from another perspective too. So there are a lot of different things that go into both fiction and nonfiction. One of the things you said about not dating a book, I think is really important. And that's, I read a book once where the central character thought in slang. And that is a great way to date your book. I mean, it really is. So you have to be really careful about the language you choose, whether you're writing nonfiction or fiction. The language should hold over years and years and years. And I also like to think that a really great book, and I know I've read you guys a lot of each of your books, and it's leaving the reader with an aftertaste of wonder.
mm,
And one of the things that my fan said was that she didn't feel there was a necessity for a sequel, even though she would love one. I always tell kids who write me, I'm not a big series person. So I always tell people who write me and say, what happened next? I say, but you take ownership of the book when you make that decision. And it's something that has changed over a period of time, and it really bothers me. There's so many fiction authors who are asked to have multiple books in a series in order to get published.
mm.
The kids will also tell me that the first book in a series is great, but the subsequent books sort of take a slope this way. And I think it's because they weren't originally thinking of a whole series, unless it's something like Tolkien, where he probably wrote it as a whole entity to begin with anyway, and it was divided up. I mean, that's another issue altogether, but something worth talking about.
So, Sally, if I could just add one thing to what you just said about having a sense of wonder as like an added element in a book that is memorable. There's a great quote from the artist and writer Edward Gorey. He said that if a book is about only one thing, it has somehow failed.
I agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If a book is only about one thing, if it's just that simplistic, then yeah, I agree with that totally. And another great quote is from Daniel Boorstin, who was the historian of the Library of Congress, and he did this series that I recommend to teens that are nonfiction, but it's sort of like historical philosophy almost, about the creators, the inventors, discoverers. And in the creators, he says the difference between an invention and a creation is that a great work of art can never be surpassed, but inventions are constantly passed or superseded by the next invention. And I think that's really important about books, that a really great book is, you can't, like Baby, she may never, she'll write a different book equally good, but she doesn't have to supersede or replace that book. And I think that's really important to understand. So we had talked about ahead of time, we discussed what we thought we might like to talk about a little bit. And one of the things that we wanted to talk about was how people found books that have value, that were about more than one thing, that have beautiful language, that have great characters, all of these things. There's so many books being published right now. It's an incredible number of books out there, both children's and otherwise. And it's a lot of them don't stick around very long, and it's really hard to know how to sort through them and how to find them. And so we thought that we might address that. So one of you guys want to take a first stab at that? Or not?
It's a tough thing these days to find a book. The whole model of publishing has, in my opinion, changed from, it used to be you would write a good book and you would try to sell it. And if it was good enough, you'd sell it. And then there were gateways basically to vet the book, sort of like Book List or School Library Journal and many other review journals that would kind of, they give a consensus, this book is worth looking at. Nowadays, and I've had many editors tell me this, it's about your platform. You have to become popular first, and then people will buy your book based on your popularity. Forget about whether it's a good book or not. It doesn't matter. If you're popular, they will buy it. And so if you don't have that platform, you're unlikely to get published a lot of times. To me, this is just a terrible turn of events, but I see that it's not going to change. I don't think it's going to change for a long time. The gateways, meanwhile, have really shrunk. There's really just one or two, I think, legitimate children's journals reviewing now that you can trust. Others have gone to a kind of a payola scheme where either the publishers are wining and dining the editors, but more likely they're just buying enough advertising in the journal to get their books reviewed, right? And so, and to me, this is just awful, but I also understand what these journals are up against because they're competing with a lot of free material on the internet, and some way they have to get to it. And it also used to be that there were a lot of conferences that would actually pay authors to come speak. Nowadays, if you get invited at all, you're on your own dime. Publishers don't have budgets to send authors unless you've already written The Hunger Games or something like that, you know. So it's a much, much difficult world right now, and especially for people who aren't willing to become popular through YouTube by breaking plates over their heads or something like that.
Yeah.
It's really
Yeah.
hard to get your audience.
Well, I think we're living with the distortions of the publishing industry, which has become so corporatized, you know, and operates on a massive scale and almost by a shotgun model of putting out lots of books to see which one of them might catch on, in combination with the same thing happening in the book selling world, where that has become so centralized. Though, I mean, I keep hearing about indie bookstores, you know, either surviving or opening. And so that's at least a bright spot where you have knowledgeable people there to recommend books. And so hopefully there'll be a little bit more of that over time. I'm not completely pessimistic about it because I mean, so many people are reading these days, you know, I mean, I don't think people have written reading off as a serious activity. Maybe not the majority of Americans, but there's a core of serious readers in America who communicate with each other. And so we'll see what happens. But I mean, my impression, you know, people keep saying publishing is dying, but it refuses to die. And and you know, for all the crappy books that are being published, there's still quite a lot of good ones. And when I was the reviewer at Parenting Magazine, I you know, for over 20 years, I thought maybe 5% of what I was seeing was really worthy. And maybe, I don't know if the percentage has changed or not, but it's never been the majority of books that are really all that interesting.
You know, I think on a couple of points. One is that Sneed mentioned how you have to be popular. What the agents and many publishers say, send us if you have 22,000 Twitter followers. Readers, followers, there is a big difference. I think that's one issue. I think the old style of bookstores became for a long time, and I don't know if this is going to continue or not, but entertainment centers where they have the cafe and they have the person come in and this has been going on for a long, long time. They have people coming in to present, and a lot of people don't come to necessarily because they want to read the book, but they want to get the author's signature. And so you've become sort of like, you almost have to be a celebrity, which goes along with 22,000 Twitter followers. And I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I think I do know that during COVID, interestingly, these kids that I work with, and a lot of them stay with me for like 10 years. They write with me from when they're 8 to 18 or 10 to 18. And because I don't tell them what to write. It's not a class, it's a writer's group. They said, oh, I'm not reading online. I guess they couldn't stand any more online, you know, time. I love real books. and they went back to real books. They said, it's so different to read a real book. And I think that's a really important, that ownership. And I find that when you put art in a real book, when it's beautifully made, where the design is beautiful, that it gives you another sense of ownership. And also, I think that you find, at least so far, that children who had a collection of books in their home, they take them with them when they leave and become adults, which I think is a real testimony to the power of a book. I think we wanted to take a few minutes, and we have about probably 10 minutes, because they said we had a few extra minutes, to just talk about a project we're working on now, just to give people an idea. And I think, and I know that Leonard, you had wanted to speak about censorship, so maybe you'd like to take this time to.
Oh, sure. Well, I'll just hold up my brand new book, which came out on Tuesday. It's called You Can't Say That. And the subtitle is Writers for Young People Talk About Censorship, Free Expression, and the Stories They Have to Tell. And it's a collection of interviews with writers from Dave Pilkey to Meg Medina, to Angie Thomas, to Catherine Patterson, and Roby Harris, the author of the book about sexuality for kids, It's Perfectly Normal. All of these writers have written books, fiction or nonfiction, picture books or older books, that have been, widely challenged and in some cases banned by schools or libraries around the country. And so I think the thing I would want to say now is just that this is a big problem in America, because we're such a polarized society. And then I kind of hope this book will at least remind people that there's a lot of value to be had in discussing different ideas about values and stories that one might offer young people, rather than just having a rant expressing opposition to this or that. It seems like there's nothing more fundamental to our society than people getting together who have different opinions about books, sharing their opinions with one another. When that's not possible, publishers become frightened, libraries become frightened, all the people who purchase books for their community or create books for their country think twice about doing something that might spark controversy, and you end up getting a much smaller culture. And that's sort of what's maybe happening now, and it's what we want to prevent from happening on into the future.
Can you hold up the cover again there?
Sure. Yeah, it's meant to look like a text that has been partly expurgated by someone. I mean, the thing is, as parents, I have a son, and we all have the right to try to shape our own children's reading life, certainly in their earlier years. But we don't really have the right to tell a whole community that they should have exactly the same opinion that we do. And one of the favorite stories I have in here is of a librarian who talked with Roby Harris, the author of the book about sexuality. She said, I would never have your book in my home for my children. But as a librarian, I feel an obligation, because it's a serious book on an important topic, to make it available to the community so everyone can make their personal choice. I think that was like one of the most wonderful statements that anybody in this book made, because it showed that you can be nuanced about these things, and you can preserve your own values at the same time as you respect other people's values. And I think that's what the First Amendment is all about.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Sallie, what are you working on?
I am working on, well, I'm sort of working on a lot of things at the same time, but one thing I'm doing is I have a book I wrote some years ago that I never finished because it has 4 points of view, and it's magical realism. And the fourth point of view was to be a comic that the main central character is trying to write, and I couldn't write comics. It's a whole nother way of writing. It's much, in terms of language, it's much narrower. So I asked my son, we did a book years ago when he was 16, he did part of a book for me, a reference section on mythology. And I asked my son, who has a PhD in modern European diplomatic history, if when COVID came along, he was bored, so he decided he would research comic books. He has a wide range of interests. And he started telling me all about the history of comic books. And I said, why don't you write the comic and I'll illustrate it? So we're in the middle of that, which also involves something interesting, which is to try to structurally be sure how the comic fits with the novel itself. And I think I'm really excited about it. He's really excited about it. Then all we have to do is find a publisher. Because again, I write out of the box. I don't like genres. I don't like being limited in what I can write by the market. And it puts me in kind of a weird place. But the other thing I'm working on is a book that I've sort of had in the back of my head a long time, but thought of as a novel and realized it's a picture book. My husband says we bought a studio with a house attached. So behind our house, we have a 400 square foot studio, over 400 square feet. And it's a separate building. And a few years ago, I painted a 20-foot dragon on the front of it. And I suddenly realized what I wanted to do was have a child follow her puppy who's gotten away from her into this yard. And the puppy ends at this dragon and he's barking like crazy. And out of the studio comes an artist who invites them into a studio. I don't think most children ever get into an artist's studio. And there's so much, when I take kids in, they're just so, they gawk, they're so excited. Our little grandson can't wait to get in there, but lots of kids are, and teenagers too. And so I thought I would do it in photography basically, and really take the kids on a tour of a real artist studio, working studio, with all of the tools and all of the supplies and and even some of the art. And so those are the two probably big projects right now, but I have lots of others that are going on. I don't know when I'm going to write, and I don't have a schedule for that. Some people do, and I don't know how my books are going to start. But a lot of people do have a system for that. So, and Sneed, what are you working on?
Well, you both mentioned the problems with mainstream publishing right now. And that's actually driven me to work with some really wonderful smaller publishers the last few years. And one of them is called Tilbury House up in Maine. And I had a book this spring come out called Waiting for a Warbler that came out. And what Leonard mentioned, how important it is to have a book about more than one thing. And this is a good example of that. It's about the difficulties of migration for songbirds, but it's also about this family that's working to improve its backyard habitat so that when the migrating birds get there, they'll have what they need to survive. And so I'm really pleased with how this book came out. And another one, I'll share a screen that's just coming out now, is called Beaver and Otter Get Along, Sort of. And I really love these illustrations by Meg Sedano here. And just because she breathes so much life into these basically nonfiction characters without turning them into people, it's a really fine line to do that. But I love the best line is probably the beginning. When Beaver wandered into the valley, he heard the most exciting sound in the entire world. Running water. The sound made Beaver's whole body quiver. It told him this is the place. And so this is not only, again, it's about two things. It's about the story of this one beaver, but it's also the story about how his actions just transform this, what was a pretty dry creek, and turned it into this just flourishing ecosystem. And so this book, I think, will be released any day here now by Source Books, which is also I actually sold it to Dawn Publications, and then they were snapped up by Source Books, which is often what happens to these really cool small publishers. But let's see, I did want to, just before our time runs out, again, share the contact information for all of us here to give you time to write it down. And while that's up, I don't know, Sallie, do you want to shut us down, so to speak, or any closing thoughts from anybody?
I would just like to really quickly mention that if you are looking for good books for kids, I do this free bi-weekly newsletter, no advertising. It's just a sort of a gift where I take on different topics about books, whether it's writing or the art or the publishing industry or whatever is going on. And if you want to subscribe, there are 2 ways to do it on this slide. Just because over the years, I not only collect kids' books, I have a huge collection, as I'm sure all 3 of us do. I can see a lot of you guys, the books in your background, and also just to share that knowledge, because so many people ask me for recommendations of books, and because so many people only see what's in the bookstores, which is pretty limited and not there very long, because they have so many books coming at them that the average book is said to be on the bookshelf 6 weeks to 3 months. And it used to be a year to a year and a half before it was considered an older book. Now, 6 weeks to 3 months, it's simply gone unless it did very, very, very well. And so that's a real issue for authors, for publishers, and for bookstores. And so I figured, well, why not? And I do have a lot of bookstores who subscribe to this. So I guess they're still looking, which is good news. So I think I hope this has been interesting to everybody who's listened in. And we do encourage you to contact us if you have questions, if you're interested in our books, or you want more information about writing or whatever it might be. I think that we're open to that. And we hope you enjoyed this as much as I know I enjoyed being here. And thank 1455 for sponsoring this wonderful festival that so many people across the country can come to, because it is virtual. That's one of the good things that I guess has sort of happened with COVID. It's nice to meet everybody in person, but this brings in an awful lot of people who might not be able to watch it otherwise. So do you guys have anything you want to add? Thank you very much for being here, Leonard and Sneed. It's been a real pleasure working with you.
And thank you, Sallie, for inviting me. And thank you, Sneed. It's been great having this chance for us to get to know each other.
I've enjoyed it too. Thanks.
I feel that way.
I think we're going to try to become the backup group for the Guns N' Roses tour.
Oh, yeah, right.
So,
There you go.
you can look for us in your town.
If I don't know if we have any, we seem to have a couple of more minutes, but maybe 3, I don't know, I'm a little, but
well, I can recall that comment of Mark Twain's, who's more than 100 years ago said that he hoped that his books would last forever, in other words, be classics. And then he said, by forever, of course, I mean at least 30 years.
Another great quote was by Isaac Asimov. They asked him 1,000,000 years ago if he thought books would ever get really small and end up on computers. And he said, oh, yes, they're going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and they're going to be on a computer, and then they're going to put it in a leather cover so it looks like a book.
Wow, he hit it on the nail.
So I guess we're ready to hand this back over to the session hosts. And again, I hope you enjoyed listening to what we had to say.
Thank you. Bye.